Hi, I'm Amber, and I'm going to be answering the question, how can God exist if evil exists? I think that we'd all agree that evil exists in our world, just like good exists. There are many different forms of evil and suffering in the world. There are small things like hurting someone's feelings or being injured by something, and then there are also really big things, like the coronavirus pandemic that we're all currently experiencing, and even death itself. The argument of the problem of evil is an argument which is against the existence of God, because the existence of evil is just simply incompatible with the idea of an all-loving and an all-powerful God. You see, an all-loving God would only want his will to be good. And if God is all-powerful, then he would be able to put a stop to any evil that came into the world. However, he doesn't put a stop to any evil. It simply just doesn't seem to make any sense for an all-loving and an all-powerful God to be able to coexist with evil. And in fact, throughout history, many people have been unable to figure out why we worship a God who doesn't prevent evil. The first idea of the problem of evil is from an ancient Greek philosopher called Epicurus. His idea is often referred to as the Epicurean paradox, or the riddle of Epicurus. And it goes like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able to, then how is he all-powerful? On the other hand, if God is able to prevent evil, but is just not willing to, then how is he all-loving? However, if God is both able to and willing to prevent evil, then why on earth does evil even exist? Later on down the line, an Australian philosopher called Hume turned this Epicurean paradox into something that we now know as the inconsistent triad. It looks like this. God is omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. God is omnibenevolent, meaning all-loving. However, evil exists. There is no logical explanation for how an omnibenevolent and an omnipotent God can coexist with evil. The three ideas are just logically inconsistent. Therefore, Hume argued that God doesn't exist. There are some arguments to try and solve the problem of evil and attempt to explain this inconsistent triad. These are ideas for why God wouldn't prevent evil and suffering, and how by not preventing it, it still makes him loving and powerful. These are called theodicies, and today I'm going to talk about two of them. So the first one is by Augustine, and this is called the soul-deciding theory. Here it is in a nutshell. Augustine's main argument is that evil is not a physical thing that exists, but rather evil is just the absence of good, just like we consider darkness to be the absence of light. This theodicy is based on the reading of Genesis 1-3, the Bible passages which are about God creating the world, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the serpent, but most importantly for this argument, sin. Augustine believed that God created his world to be wholly good, and that it's in fact us humans who are responsible for evil. He believed that God gave us free will because he's loving and powerful. However, when he created Adam and Eve, they took advantage of this free will and they ate from the tree of knowledge when they were clearly told not to. As a result of them disobeying God, the world has forever since been corrupt, with evil as a punishment because of them disobeying God. Adam and Eve created a lack of good within themselves by disobeying God, and because of the lack of good within them, they created it for all humans after them. This is called the fall. And this essentially means that because of this lack of good, we are all born with original sin. None of us are born innocent, because Adam and Eve are always going to be seminally present inside all of us. So because of this, Augustine came up with the idea that all suffering for us humans is actually deserved because it was us who created it in the first place. He said that all evil is either a sin or a punishment for a sin. Now, like with every theory and idea, there are strengths and weaknesses. So although Augustine's theory that God giving humans free will has resulted in evil is a fair argument, how would humans even know how to act in evil ways if God hadn't created evil himself, seeing as God created everything? You see, it doesn't make sense, and it's logically impossible for evil to just appear out of nowhere without being created. Surely, if God had created good in the world, he must be responsible for the lack of good too. In addition to this, Adam and Eve being seminally present within everyone might make sense on a spiritual kind of level. However, it's definitely unloving for God to make innocent people suffer for something that they didn't even do. So, for example, when a baby is born, they haven't actually got the ability to do anything wrong. So how is it fair that they're born with original sin and will experience evil and eventually death in life? We might respond to this by thinking that it doesn't seem to make sense to worship a God who isn't all-loving. The final and arguably most important weakness for the Augustinian theory is that it just contradicts a lot of scientific theories, such as evolution. This is because if God created humans, he must have known that in order for us to survive, like any animal on earth, we must sometimes act selfishly. This is just the nature of the way that we were created. So therefore, we can't be blamed for evil if it was built inside us for survival. We must blame God for this. Finally, it is both unscientific and immoral to assume that Adam is seminally present in us because we're clearly not born with the guilt of Adam's sin. And if God was all loving, he wouldn't let us suffer for something that we didn't actually do. So these counter-arguments to this theodicy actually suggest that an all-loving God can't actually coexist with evil, and therefore this theodicy doesn't really work. The second theodicy that we can explore is by Irenaeus, and this is called the soul-making theodicy. Irenaeus believed that God was partly responsible for the evil in the world, and this is because he had loving reason for it. He believed that God created humans imperfectly, and that it was a human's task to develop into God's likeness and be perfect. But we can only do this if we have the opportunity to make decisions based upon our own free will. And we also need to have the opportunity to choose evil over good, as this just allows us to recognise what good actually is. Therefore, God couldn't have made us perfect, because that's something that we need to do on our own to develop into perfect humans and eventually go to heaven. This is the reason why God gave us free will to make our own choices, and Irenaeus believed that this is one of God's most loving acts. Because of this free will, God can't intervene with any decisions that we make, because that would mean that we don't really have free will and that it's just God influencing us. So this explains why we have evil in the world, despite still having an all-loving and all-powerful God. This argument alone isn't actually very convincing, because some people can easily find weaknesses in this argument, including the questions: if God has the power to intervene with evil whenever it occurs, why wouldn't he just put a stop to it? And all evil isn't just based on humans' decisions. There are other forms of evil, so why would God allow these to happen? A 20th century philosopher called John Hick actually developed this Irenaean theodicy, and he came up with his own ideas on it. Hick decided that the reason that God doesn't intervene with any evil that goes on in the world is because of something called the epistemic distance. This means that God distances himself from us, and he doesn't make any decisions for humans or help us in any sort of way. Because this way, we can choose for ourselves, and we can choose whether we want to obey God or not. If God was to make his presence known, humans would just be completely overwhelmed by his expectations, and we would all obey God because we'd be aware that he's watching our every move. So God's just going to let us choose freely for what we want to do. In addition to this, if humans were created perfectly and there was no evil, then there simply just wouldn't be any need for an afterlife, because Earth would already be our paradise. Although Hick's development of Irenaeus' argument is slightly more convincing, there are still many weaknesses to the theory, the main one being immense suffering. Although it makes sense that evil allows us to know what's right and wrong, how can things so evil such as, let's say, the Holocaust, be justified? During the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish people were murdered. They were all innocent people who followed God's laws as they were religious, and they didn't deserve for their lives to be ended so brutally. It seems unfair for an all-loving and all-powerful God to allow this level of evil. A philosopher who really focuses on this criticism is called William Rowe. He highlights that immense suffering is simply just unnecessary. He gives the example of a baby deer being trapped in a forest fire and then experiencing a slow and painful death. This suffering that the deer experienced is actually absolutely nothing to do with humans' decisions, so why did the animal have to suffer? And what was the need for the immense amount of pain that poor animal experienced? Rowe concluded that an all-loving and an all-powerful God would not allow this level of brutality, and he believed that a God cannot exist with evil like this. In conclusion, The problem of evil is a question throughout time that nobody has been able to provide a valid solution for. How an all-loving and an all-powerful God can coexist with evil is a question that we may never know the answer to. We might feel that the only logical explanation we can come to is that God doesn't exist. However, we actually have no concrete evidence to prove that God does or doesn't exist. The Big Bang Theory could be argued to be evidence against the existence of God. However, this is still just a theory. And it could also be argued that God created the Big Bang in the first place. But at the end of the day, the existence of God and the problem of evil is always open to interpretation, and everybody will have a different idea and opinion on it. So what do you think?